Welcome back, HC Nation. Howdy, history wanderers, maybe? You're listening to the Adventure Box Podcast, the podcast that straps a saddle on the past and rides straight into the Americans' wild stories. I'm your host, Zach Edwards, and today we're blazing a new trail through the westward expansion of United States, of the West. In this episode, we're going to go over three things. Okay, first, we're going to meet the lesser-known president with a big part in shaping the West. His name is Millard Fillmore. President Millard Fillmore. The second thing we're going to be talking about is the ride through the frontier cities of Kansas, Missouri, where basically the railroads, the rivers, and the rowdy politics all collided all at once. And over a long period of time, too. Next thing, the last thing we're going to be talking about, the final venture into the deep West. Now, we're not going to be talking about certain places, but certain places we will talk about, because that will be followed up by more of those those deep West cities. We'll be talking about that on Wednesday. Today's Monday. We're going to start it off and come back on Wednesday. So we're going to be talking about cities like Denver, and Salt Lake, and San Francisco, and how they basically exploded with gold, grit, and guts. That's right. So saddle up. This ride's got politics, pioneers, prairie towns, and also promises. But first, let's start talking about Fillmore. Who was this guy, Fillmore? President Millard Fillmore. So let's start in the White House. We're not going to go back to his childhood. If you want that, check out the textbook. But if you want to know about him and the westward expansion, let's go back to about July 9th, 1850, when President Zachary Taylor dies suddenly, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, steps in. That's right. He was a vice president who took over for a president who died. So, most people forget about him, but Millard Fillmore served between 1850 and 1853. He had a huge impact during the tense moments where Americans were going west. You know, like the West Side Story, the Westward story. So things to know. The U.S. had just acquired a huge chunk of land from Mexico in 1848. Why? What happened? That's right, the Mexican-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This gave us California, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Nevada. A lot of places. So much more. Now, the big question is, what do we do with all this land? All this new land? We just bring it in, and what do we do about it? Here's a question that was on everyone's lips. Were we going to make it a free state or a slave state? Or make it just a territory? All of these different areas. So, the next thing that came was called the Compromise of 1850. And Fillmore signed it into law. Here's what it did. Okay, first, California became a free state. Okay, so one more for the free states. Great. More power to get rid of slavery. Utah, New Mexico territories get to decide slavery by popular sovereignty. So they got to decide if they're going to be a slave state or a non-slave state. And slave trade is now banned in D.C. Okay, so that was a southern state, well, a southern district of Columbia, D.C. That was a slave area, district. And then the last one, and this is very controversial, it was the Fugitive Slave Act. It passed. What does that mean? It means if somebody's a slave and they run away, they're actually supposed to be nabbed and brought back to the South, to their original owners, as they say, owners. So, yeah, Fillmore didn't start the fire, but he definitely fanned the flames. He also supported infrastructure projects like, get this one, the expansion of the railroads, from East Coast to West Coast, all the way through. He also improved western ports all along the California coast. He put a lot of money into that infrastructure and even proposed trade with Japan to open up the Pacific commerce, which actually happened a little bit later, but it was thanks to him. So Millard Fillmore, he might have been a quiet guy, but he had a big footprint. Now, let's go a little bit more into the West and what was happening. So, let's shift from the White House into the wide open frontier, especially in Kansas and Missouri. Guess what? That's my hometown. I'm from Missouri, and I do work. I used to flip homes on the side in Kansas, in Leavenworth. So, these were gateway states. Sorry, little rant over there. These are gateway states during the westward expansion. So let's explore some of these cities. First off, let's talk about St. Louis, Missouri. This is called the Gateway of the West. You know, the big arch? Yeah, that's right. The big metal arch that right in front of the river, that is known as the Gateway. And people travel up to it, up top, because it's like a few hundred feet off the ground, where you can actually look over and see like everything around you. It's really cool. You got to check it out. I've done it a few times. So this city of St. Louis is located on the Mississippi River. It became a launching point for settlers, traders, and explorers. As they're going west, they wanted to stop off in St. Louis. Now, as St. Louis started building up, so did other cities further in. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But St. Louis was so well known because of a few things. One, steamboats. Steamboats would come up the Mississippi, park, let the people off, take new people on, and they'd go up and down, adding more people, more supplies, agriculture that was raised. It would be put on the river and barged down. This was so important. What else? Wagons. And later, railroads all converged here in St. Louis. It was home to fur traders and hosted the Lewis and Clark expedition about, 40 years ago? Wait a second. See, we're talking about 1840 or so. So that it actually started, the Lewis and Clark expedition started in 1804. Returned the next year. Now, that was St. Louis. Let's come to my hometown, Kansas City. So Kansas City, Missouri is a diamond in the rough. It is one of the greatest places to live in right now, but at the same time, and yes, people will question if that's actually true, but think of this. Well, you're paying, what, $3, $4 for gas? We're paying just about $2 in gas. Yeah, everything is cheaper in Missouri. Love it here. It also has a highway, now this is modern times, highway going north and south from Canada to Mexico and East Coast to West Coast. It's one of the only cities with the exact cross of these two different transit avenues. Okay, now let's go back in time. Back to the westward expansion. Originally, it was a trading post. That's all it was. It was a small fort trading post. And it grew very quickly due to its location and also confluence of the Missouri and the Kansas River. So when those two came together, that's where agriculture and fur and everything else came, and then came down the Missouri River. Okay, by the mid-1800s, it became a transit hub, transportation hub for settlers moving west and cattle coming from Texas. That's where the trains would pick up the cattle and bring them into the East Coast. So that's why it was so important. But here's the big thing. That wasn't the biggest and most important city in the area. Just outside Kansas City was a place called Independence. Now this town was the official jump-off point for the Oregon Trail, California, Santa Fe trails, all of them. They all started in Independence. Might have come from St. Louis, but they all broke off from Independence. Picture it. Wagons being loaded, oxen being hitched, last supplies being brought in, and then boom, there is nothing in front of you. You just leave independence and you're looking out into wide open, wild wilderness and empty plains, minus buffalo and Native Americans. So yeah, it was a big thing right there. Okay, another one, Lawrence, Kansas. Now, why was Lawrence, Kansas so important? It was founded by anti-slavery settlers from Massachusetts. That's right, they started that city trying to get away from it. When they got into Missouri at this point, it was a slave state. So they kept going. And they went on to the other side of the river where they could actually be free from slavery. This became the center of breeding Kansas. What? What in the world is breeding Kansas? It was the violent clash between pro-slavery and free soil supporters in the 1850s. So you're going to have to read a lot more about that in the text. A lot of stuff over there. Just read it there. But this is why it was important. Why was Lawrence, Kansas so important? It was important in showing how settlers wasn't just about land, it was about identity and politics. Again, they weren't there mostly for land. They were there because they wanted to get away from slavery. So these cities were more than just dots on a map. They were pressure points in the West. In the story for the West, they were places where everything changed. They were where the future collides with the frontier. That's basically it. Okay, let's talk about the third thing, the cities of the Deep West. Now, some of them we're going to be talking about a little bit more when we talk about California next week, on Wednesday. But before then, we're going to talk about a few of these important cities. So we have Salt Lake. Let's talk about that. Okay. Last week, I think it was last week, we talked about the Mormon pioneers. You remember that? How they were persecuted in New York, moved to, Ohio. Then they're persecuted in Ohio, moved to Missouri. Persecuted under an extermination order, means people could kill them for no reason, and moved over to Illinois. And they started to rival Illinois. They started to rival Chicago as the biggest city, and they were thriving, and people got scared because they were against slavery, which Illinois was mostly against slavery, but they were against things that others were not. And they wanted to be friends with the Native Americans, so they had to get rid of them. So because of politics, they had to push those Mormons out. So now, from that point, it was about the time when Joseph Smith, the original prophet, was shot and killed. So he was killed by a mob while he was in jail waiting to go to court. And the court was set up as a way to keep him in jail, to keep him away from the people that he was there. He was also, around the same time, Joseph Smith was actually running for president, actually a few years before. And with all these different courtings, it was like, what did you say, lawfare? That's right. They started doing that a few years ago. Well, okay, they've been doing that for generations. But they were just doing that against our president, Donald J. Trump. So, yeah, same kind. Lawfare to keep people from doing certain things they did not like. When they found out they couldn't do that, such as when they found out that killing their prophet didn't move them out, didn't scare them away, that's when they had to finally push them out. So, the Mormon pioneers from Nauvoo, Illinois. And actually, I traveled there just a few days ago just to see what it was like, and it was quite the place. It's like, check this out. So this was land that nobody wanted. It was full of swamps, and a lot of the members of their church, the Mormons, actually died while digging irrigation ditches out to the river, out to the Mississippi, because of malaria. This is a disease that attacks you from mosquitoes biting you and passing on this disease, and you could die. You could survive from it, but it was a very painful, very uncomfortable position. And most of these Mormons were in camps. They were living in tents at the time, so malaria spread quickly. But as soon as they were able to get the irrigation in, drain off the lands, because some of the it wasn't the water from the river per se, it was the water from the natural springs that were coming into this area. But of course, anybody wanted to give them that land. They wanted to sell them that land as fast as possible because nobody wanted it. Well, the Mormons, they decided they wanted it, so they put in irrigation. They did all these other things, and they were able to make it a thriving community and a thriving city, which then scared everyone because it was rivaling Chicago at the time. So that's when they had to push them out during the winter. And in February, it's like, 1846 or 1845. I think it was 1846. Again, this is off memory from my trip there. 1846, they left in February and were pushed out in February during the snow. It was so cold, I'm thinking like Trail of Tears type of cold, where 4,000 Cherokee died? Well, 1,000 Mormons died as they were pushed out across the frozen Mississippi. Think of the Mississippi, major river going through the United States. Very fast pace, and it froze. It was so cold. They had to walk over that. Then they had to go find a place that they could actually make their own temporarily until they could make it further. Now, to exacerbate that just a little bit, remember, Joseph Smith was just killed. So they had to find a new leader. And this actually broke up the Mormon church. You had Brigham Young, who led people west, and you had some that actually stayed in Nauvoo, persecuted for what they believed. Well, those people that stayed, they became the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then they became the Community of Christ, which is still around the Mississippi area. Brigham Young brought those people out to, over the plains, and he gets to the top of a hill, looks out over this valley. He says, "This is the place." So they went down into what was basically desert, and they started putting in irrigation. They had a lot of faith and very isolated, and this created what is now Salt Lake City, one of the biggest hubs, biggest cities in the U.S. Salt Lake became the center of the Utah Territory and a refuge for thousands that were persecuted in all different ways. So that's Salt Lake. From there, Brigham Young actually sent people up north and south as well. So they traveled all over Idaho and set up towns up there. They traveled down through Nevada and Arizona and set up towns there. Vegas. Places in Arizona, I can't think of any. Prescott. So, here we go. Now, next one, Denver, Colorado. Denver's awesome. I used to live there also. Wow, this is funny. These are all these states or these cities I'm from. So outside of college, I actually moved there to start building homes. I was a business manager, also made construction manager, and I helped facilitate the construction of a lot of homes before 2008 and the economic downfall. And when that happened, I was forced out because I could not find work in Colorado. The next place was actually Salt Lake. That's right. So Salt Lake I'm actually part of too. Interesting. Okay. All of these states I've been talking about. And that's not me. That's just how we put it together. So funny. Okay. So Denver, Colorado, originally called Denver City. It started as a mining camp in 1858. So think of this. And I've always questioned this. If I was a business person, and say I was coming up west, and I got to a point where it's like, you know what, I could go over the Rockies, and there's like no supplies out here, or I could build a city that could actually sustain life in case people came out late. They could come to Denver, to my fort, my area, and they could be safe over the winter. How many people died crossing the Rockies because they went over the winter? You had, You had the Donner Party. You had a lot of people. We'll just put it that way. Sorry, I'm going to get distracted by this. And I was like, they should have built a city right there, especially just before the gold rush. You know, in 1849, they call them 49ers. Yeah. But it was 10 years later that they actually created Denver City and started as a mining town where they actually went after Pikes Peak gold rush. That's right, there was another gold rush outside of California. So you had California, you had Nevada, you had, which we will talk about Wednesday, you also had Denver, and you had Alaska. which again, I'm from too. So I've been all over the place. So here we go. Denver City grew fast. Because of what? Because this is where the railroad came through. And it's positioned between the plains and the Rockies. Get this. So there would be times when the Rockies were full of snow. And yet everything down below in Denver had grass, had trees blooming still. It would be warm down here, cold up here in the Rockies. It was the perfect place. So I don't know why no one would have started that until 10 years later. Now, because of this, it became a major trading post. Look at that. Trading post, but 10 years later. And a very specific mining depot for miners heading deeper west. Whether they're going deep west, they're staying in the mines in Colorado, they're going down to Nevada. There's all these different places. So that's another thing to know about. This is why Denver was so important as a hub for the safety of the people. Again, 10 years later after I would have done it. Again, that's foresight, right? I could see things that they wouldn't have seen when they were actually living it. So we had what? Salt Lake. We had Denver. Let's keep going west. Let's go to San Francisco. San Francisco. Okay. This was a booming town of the Pacific. In 1846, it was a sleepy village. It was called Yerba Buena. Buena. Sorry. Yerba Buena. So that was 1846. Then, 1849 came around, the 49ers, the gold rush started. So by 1850, thanks to the gold rush, it became a bustling, chaotic port city, filled with ships, prospectors, bankers, and gamblers. Okay, let's go through a few of those. Okay, so ships had to transport. Where were they transport? They had to go all the way down beyond South America, around the tip, and come back up to the East Coast. But it was actually one of the safer ways of traveling. And before the railroad came in. Then you had prospectors. Who were they? They were the ones that mined for the gold. And a lot of times, they didn't make much money because it was the people supplying them with food and with supplies and with tools. They were the ones making out. Who else was making out? Of course, it was the bankers. The bankers would take your gold and give you cash money for it. You're like, great, now I can go buy stuff at the supply store and have nothing afterwards. That's right. So what happened? A lot of people needed a relaxing point. They needed to get away from the hustle and bustle of mining. So they became gamblers. Oh, the cow. If you don't lose your money to the bankers, you don't lose your money to the suppliers, you might as well lose the money in gambling, right? I guess that's what some people would say. But the popularity or the population in San Francisco exploded from about 1,000 people to 25,000 people in just a couple of years. Now, funny enough, you'd say, well, most big cities are like 1 million people now. Yes, but remember, 1,000 people to like 2 or 3 years later, 2,500. And it was hard to get there. So that's a pretty big success story for San Francisco. Now, it was the Deep West's global city, basically. That's what it was. It connected the trade routes of Asia, Latin America, and the East Coast. All of them came through San Francisco and then down around the Cape and back up to the East Coast. Now, what other city in California was so important? Let's talk about Sacramento. Oh, you know what? We're going to hold off on this until we talk about everything else. So on Wednesday, we're going to talk a lot more about San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and such. So these cities were it was shaped by different forces. Let's just talk about some of them. There was gold. Duh. Gold rush. That's right. Everyone came for the gold. Well, not everyone. Part of it was also religion. People traveled to California to get away from all the hustle of the East Coast. Well, while we're talking about that, let's talk about trade. People wanted to go over there because there was opportunity. And so they wanted this opportunity. Because there was so much immigration coming in from Europe into the East Coast, people were traveling around the Cape and coming to San Francisco, or traveling via the trails to San Francisco, or to Denver, or to, what was the other one? Salt Lake. So these were dangerous places to get to, but they were, again, gold, religion, especially the Mormons, and then you have trade and opportunities. So these all were built into this westward, let's just call it a machine that basically pulled people to go into the West because of a crucial, like, cogs that we say that is in the Western machine. So all these different things working together. So let's wrap this up a little bit. Let's go through what some of the things we talked about in this episode. So first, we talked about a man by the name of what? President what? Yeah, Fillmore, but what's his middle name? Or what's his first name? Millard. That's right. You might not have ever heard about him, but he is President Millard Fillmore. He was the vice president to who? Who? That's right, Zachary Taylor. Okay, he might have been forgotten, but he helped push a lot of the westward expansion, especially with the Compromise of 1850, which basically shaped how new western lands were organized. The next thing we talked about was Kansas and Missouri. These were cities that became the frontier front lines and were filled with wagons, railroads, and a lot of conflict. Again, there's so much more in the books. You got to read it. Then finally, the Deep West gave birth to cities like Denver, Salt Lake, San Francisco, and so much more. And we will talk about them next on Wednesday. But each of these have a backstory of either faith, fortune, or freedom, which is why they grew so quickly. And the American West wasn't just one story, it was millions of stories. Every single person had a different story. They could be traveling together and they still have a different story. So this was the lineup for millions of stories to be passed. Crossing plains, going down rivers, going through deserts, crossing the ocean, not crossing it, but going around the ocean, around the around the Americas to get to San Francisco. And a lot of stories in the way of ideas. So, thanks for riding the range with me today on the Adventure Box podcast. Again, I am Zach Edwards, your friendly historian and wagon guide, reminding you that history isn't just about trails and treaties. It's about the people, the places that built the world, especially America, talking about early American history. One brick, one board, or one gold nugget at a time. If you liked this episode, leave a review. Share your thoughts. I stopped doing this for a little while, but I have a action question for you. How would you have traveled if you wanted to go to San Francisco? Would you have traveled over the plains? Or would you have taken a ship around the coast? Or would you have just waited for the railroad to get you there, even though you'd be there like 10 years after the gold rush had already started? You'd be like the way in the back of everyone else. How would you have gone? If you could have chosen which way you'd gone. Most of the time, people didn't have the money, so they had to travel over land. But if you didn't have that as a barrier, how would you have gone there? Please put them in the comments below. Love to hear what you think. We'll even mention them if you put your comments down there. So thanks so much for joining us. We will catch you next time. Have a great day. Bye, all. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.